thank you for coming to the last class in this series. I've enjoyed presenting them. I appreciate the fact that you've come back and participated as well. Today, I'd like to talk about Senators Burton K. Wheeler and Mike Mansfield, who are two quite different men with different backgrounds, different approaches, different histories. Several preliminary things before I get started. I would continue to encourage your questions and comments as we go along. If you like, you can type them in as a chat, and I can read the chat and respond as I proceed, or I'll pause occasionally and ask if there are questions or discussions if you want to unmute yourselves and ask or discuss them orally. I'm also available to answer questions or talk with you about the class via email. My email address is paul3707@aol.com. And my mailing address, if you want to send a check for a book, is 2555 North Price Road, number 1-2015 in Chandler, Arizona, 85224. So you can order any number of copies at that price, and that will be good for another couple of weeks. So if there's anyone you'd like to give the book to as a Christmas present, now's the time to do it. One other preliminary thing, I guess, about the University of Montana books. I had another conversation last Friday with Ashby Kinch, who is both the dean of the University of Montana Graduate School, and he's the custodian of the University of Montana Press, and talked about both the Merriam book and the Denison manuscript that hadn't been completed. And I think I now understand better what the situations are there. It's not as though the university has forgotten about the Merriam book. They've just chosen not to reprint it. And they don't have the resources. They're unwilling to spend resources to print the book. Dr. Kinch said he was not adverse to publishing it, but it would require some philanthropy to do that, to pay the publication cost. But it's also clear from what Kinch told me and an email I received from Harvey Fritz, that what George Denison was doing was not picking up the history from where Merriam left off, which I had thought, but he was starting over again. And there was the clue to that, I guess I should have realized all along, was when he sent me an email back when I asked him in December 2016 what he planned to do and what was going on with his book. He said that the Merriam book was more memoir than history. I quoted that in the University of Montana chapter. And so what he was planning to do was to retell the story from the beginning from a more institutional point of view, perhaps because the university is unhappy with the Merriam history. I don't know, but Denison got sidetracked. He knew, I'm sure, he was dying soon, and he went off on the sidetrack of Dr. Morton Elrod, the influential political biology professor in the University of Montana's early years. So there it is. You know, the Merriam book is there. If someone wants to contribute toward republishing it, or find someone who would write an afterword and publish it, that could be done. I don't think the university is enthusiastic about doing that. And in the meantime, the Denison manuscript is just sitting there in the archives at the University of Montana Library. Harry Fritz told me that Denison had gotten up into the 1940s, and Dr. Kinch confirmed that. So it's got a long ways to go. I don't know whether it will ever be done. So in the meantime, it turns out that the only published history of the University of Montana, for better or worse, is the chapter in my book about that. And that will continue as long until somebody chooses to do something about either republishing the Merriam book or finishing or redoing the Denison manuscript. So that's where that stands. Um, Talking about Burton K. Wheeler and Mike Mansfield, two very different men. They lived in different times, which slightly overlapped in the 1940s, but their backgrounds were different. They were different personalities and different approaches, both very influential in the politics of their time. And so you have to sort of see how that developed as their careers went along. Wheeler was born in 1882 in Massachusetts. He went to the University of Michigan Law School. He did not go to college. Apparently it was possible then, and it is now still in some places possible to get into a law school without having gone to college. So he graduated from the University of Michigan Law School at age 23 in 1905, and then decided to go west for his legal career. The dean of the law school suggested that he join a big law firm in the East. He didn't want to do that, so he decided to go west. And here there are two quite different stories of what he did when he went west, and I've referred to them at page 9-2 of my chapter. The Oberdorfer book, the Johnston book, which is authoritative, I think, in every other respect, says that Wheeler went straight from Michigan west toward Seattle, stopped off in Butte, lost his money in a poker game and decided to stay. But the other account is the John and Catherine Morrison account in their Mavericks book, which says that Wheeler really had an extended tour of the West before he ended up in Butte. He had learned that there was a lawyer in Eureka, California, who was selling his practice. Wheeler decided to go there until he learned that you could only get to Eureka then by boat, which was more remote than he had in mind. And so he went on an extended tour of the West during the next several months. Los Angeles, Portland, Tucson, cities in Colorado, Salt Lake City, and Ogden. And he ended up in Butte in October 1905. At this point, then you can compare where he is with what's going on generally. At that point, Fritz Heinze is still in Butte. And Mike Mansfield is 2 years old. Daley has died 5 years before. Clark is still in the Senate in 1905. So Wheeler arrives. He looks around. He finds one position that pays $50 a month with a lawyer in Butte. He decides that's not enough. And so when he's leaving to go to Spokane, not Seattle, he gets into this poker game, loses his money, and decides to stay. He practiced law for a couple of years and got married to his sweetheart, who had waited for him to succeed in law practice before they got married. But in 1910, after 5 years, he decided to run for the Montana legislature. He, at this point, legislative candidates were nominated by party conventions, not in open primaries. That didn't come until later. So he is nominated by the Democratic Party convention in Butte. He's supported by the Anaconda Company. He's in the legislature at age 28. He's the youngest person in the legislature, but he runs afoul of the Anaconda Company when he supports Thomas Walsh, who was then a Helena lawyer, for the Senate, rather than W.G. Conrad, who was a Great Falls banker who the Anaconda Company supported. So Walsh and Conrad deadlocked. Finally, Walsh withdrew a Democrat, Henry Myers, was elected as a compromise candidate to be the senator. But that caused Wheeler to lose the confidence of the Anaconda Company. And as the result, he could not become a member of the Democratic convention or get on the list to be reelected to the legislature in 1912. So what he does instead is he campaigns in the state Democratic convention to be nominated as Attorney General. He almost succeeds. He loses by 3 votes. And then when that fails, Walsh is elected to the Senate in 1912, the other position. And when Walsh is seated and the other senator is Myers, they recommend that Wheeler be appointed as U.S. Attorney. So he bounces from unsuccessful legislative campaign to unsuccessful run for governor to U.S. Attorney, and he serves there for 5 years. The first 4 years apparently are routine, but he does 2 things that causes controversy. One is that he prosecutes politically active people for fraud in connection with the issuance of stock in an investment venture, and he refuses to prosecute people who are thought to be guilty of sedition in violation of the anti-sedition statutes that were passed at the time. So he's hauled before the Montana Defense Council, and he's getting criticism from the press, and he's becoming an embarrassment to Senator Walsh, who is running for re-election in 1918. So Wheeler withdraws, and to permit Walsh to campaign successfully for re-election, and goes back to law practice. But then he reappears in 1920 to run for governor. I think I might have misspoke earlier. In 1912, he was running for attorney general, not governor. 1920, it's governor. But at this point, Wheeler's opponent is Joseph Dixon, who was from Missoula. He owned the Missoulian newspaper. He was elected by the legislature to the Senate in 1907, replacing William Clark. And then he was defeated by Walsh in 1913, after Montana had passed an advisory provision that required the legislature to elect whoever the citizens chose at an advisory ballot. So at this point, the press is all over Wheeler. Anaconda Company supports Dixon, even though he's relatively progressive. Wheeler is badly defeated, but he's like the Energizer Bunny. He never quits. The next time up, it's the United States Senate in 1922, and by this point, Wheeler had been supported by the National Progressive League. They had captured the Democratic Party. Senator Myers withdrew from the Democratic Party because he could not coexist with them. And when he ran and then he decided to retire in 1922, leaving the open position. So Wheeler is elected to the Senate in 1922 when he is 40 years old, really relatively young to be a senator. He starts then in 1923, and this is a time when Republicans are in control in the Senate. William G. Harding has been elected president in 1920. Harding has a heart attack and dies in the fall of 1923. replaced by Calvin Coolidge. So Thomas Walsh initially, and then Wheeler begin to go after Harding's and Coolidge's appointments. Walsh is tracking down the Teapot Dome scandal with investigations in the Senate, and Walsh decides to go after Harry Doherty, who was Harding's attorney general, all from the state of Ohio, with various claims of misconduct. Initially, Coolidge kept Doherty as his attorney general, but then when conflicts of interest became apparent, Coolidge removed him. But before that happened, Wheeler started an investigation in the Senate. Doherty counterattacked with indictments against Wheeler, both in Montana and in Washington, D.C., accusing him of improper conduct in representing clients while he was a senator, which eventually led to dismissals. So there was that was going on. Wheeler was really in the lead in investigating the scandals within the Coolidge administration. But he also decided that in the 1924 presidential election, that he did not like who the Democrats had nominated. And so he was asked by Robert La Follette, who had been nominated for president by the Progressive Party, to run with him as vice president of the Progressive Party, which was a third party. La Follette was nominally a Republican. He'd been a progressive for 20 years. Wheeler was disaffected with the Democrats. He retained his label as a Democrat and did a lot of speaking for La Follette and the progressives. They did fairly well. They got about 16% of the vote nationally, but that was unsuccessful. La Follette was drummed out of the Republican Party as the result. Wheeler was able to slide back into the Senate as a Democrat, but this was a time when Democrats were in the minority in the Senate, and I think the only thing he could do was to continue to vote against Republican legislation. Wheeler then became one of the early, well, let me stop and ask, are there any comments or questions so far? That I would say is the end of the first period in Wheeler's career, when the pre-Roosevelt period. Comments, questions? I don't see anything on the chat. All right. Wheeler had determined that Roosevelt had the best chance of being elected in 1932. So he became one of the earliest supporters of Roosevelt. He spoke on his behalf at a Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner in New York. He supported Roosevelt in North Dakota when he first announced his intentions to become president. And he asked Huey Long to support Roosevelt, became acquainted with Huey Long from Louisiana when Long became a senator. So Roosevelt becomes the nominee. Wheeler campaigns for him. Roosevelt's elected by a substantial majority. There's some comment that perhaps Wheeler might have been considered for vice president at that point, but there really isn't any substance to it. Roosevelt chose John Nance Garner because Garner had delivered Texas votes to Roosevelt. But initially, Wheeler was a strong supporter of Roosevelt and the New Deal. The only problem with Roosevelt, from Wheeler's point of view, was that Roosevelt's solutions favored an increased federal bureaucracy to solve the various problems to help end the Depression. And Wheeler began to think that Roosevelt's approach had gone too far, that he did not like the growing concentration of power in the executive branch, did not like Roosevelt's tendency to assume dictatorial powers, and he did not like being ignored by Roosevelt and his administration in areas that Wheeler cared about. For example, one of Wheeler's areas of interest was silver monetization policy. We've talked about that before in connection with the history of Butte and silver mining in Butte. But Wheeler made clear that he wanted to be involved in silver monetization policy. He was ignored. Wheeler was unhappy with that. And so there was that issue that disturbed Wheeler. Wheeler was also interested in Indian affairs, and the administration proposed a bill that would radically change the organization of Indian tribes, relation of Indian tribes with the government. And Wheeler was chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee. He introduced the bill, apparently without reading it carefully, found that he didn't like it. He made some amendments to it, and he didn't like how the Bureau of Indian Affairs administered the statute. So that was another area where Wheeler disagreed with what Roosevelt's policy was in an area where Wheeler had a particular interest. One of Wheeler's major issues was utility company regulation. Wheeler had become chair of the Senate Interstate Commerce Committee in 1935. And he disliked, at that point, the way utility companies were organized was that there were interstate holding companies that made it possible to concentrate power in, pardon the pun, with utility interest industry. So Wheeler was determined that those holding companies should be dissolved, and there was a bill proposed that would do that. That was discussed and debated in the Senate. Roosevelt said that he would support the so-called death sentence under limited circumstances. And it was the bill finally was resolved on the basis that there was a so-called death sentence ending interstate utility holding companies, which was a victory for utility regulation. This is now about 1935. So by this point, 1935 or so, Wheeler is increasingly disillusioned with Roosevelt and is not particularly interested in supporting his reelection, but he's asked to do it. He does speak on Roosevelt's behalf. Roosevelt is reelected by a landslide over Alf Landon in 1936. And so Roosevelt then has his second term. Roosevelt had been increasingly unhappy with the fact that the Supreme Court was holding his New Deal legislation unconstitutional. And so Roosevelt proposed his famous or infamous court packing scheme in February 1937, after he'd been reelected. And what that was that for every federal judge who was age 70 and did not retire within 6 months after becoming 70, another federal judge would be appointed to add to the position. Now, you can't get rid of federal judges because they have life terms, but it's possible to add more judges and, in effect, pack the Supreme Court and add more federal judges to the lower federal courts. So that's the proposal. And Wheeler immediately decides that he's going to oppose that plan. He's going to try to block it in the Senate. He organizes hearings in testimony in opposition to that proposal. The Chief Justice says that the court doesn't really need any more judges. They're really getting along just fine. And finally, this is discussed pages 18, 19 of my chapter, Roosevelt's proposal is defeated. The Senate votes to refer the matter back to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which kills it. And Roosevelt is really unhappy about that, because that was something that was very, very important to him, the test of his political power, and Wheeler was able to block him. So Roosevelt decides then that he's going to get all of the Democratic senators who opposed him on the court packing proposal, including Wheeler. And Wheeler says, well, he will campaign for all of those senators to obtain their reelection. So what, now at this point, Wheeler's been elected in 22, 28, 34. He's not up for reelection until 1940. The court packing episode occurs in 1937. So what Roosevelt decides to do is to encourage the election or reelection of Jerry O'Connell, who was a Democratic congressman from Western Montana, with the thought that O'Connell would then run against Wheeler in 1940. But Wheeler decides instead to go after O'Connell, and does defeat O'Connell through his political connections. And instead, a Republican named Jacob Thorkelson is elected to Congress, who only lasts for one term. So Wheeler was able to protect himself against O'Connell by getting rid of O'Connell. And on the other hand, he was able to campaign and help all of the other Democratic senators who had opposed Roosevelt's court packing plan, so that they were all reelected. Now, the times, so we then get up to about 1940. And the question then is Roosevelt going to run for a third term? Wheeler is being talked about as someone who might run for president, but he really can't do that if Roosevelt hasn't communicated what he's going to do, and if Roosevelt, in fact, is going to run. And at this point, Wheeler is beginning to pick up some opposition within Montana because of his lack of support of Roosevelt, and because of his increasing opposition to the idea that the United States should support Great Britain and possibly enter World War II. So the Democrats, some Democrats in Montana support Harrison Freeborn to be the Democratic Senate nominee. Wheeler is able to defeat him. Harrison Freeborn had been Montana's Attorney General. He later became a justice on the Montana Supreme Court. And, as one of these quirks of coincidence, I've known Harrison Freeborn's son, Mike, since we were both in the third grade at McKinley School in Butte. Mike is now living in Arizona and comes to the Montana group that I belong to. And so we've maintained contact through the years. So the way that ends up is that the Wheeler is reelected to the Senate, but in the Democratic convention and prior to the convention, the Democratic delegates from Montana are instructed to hold back from supporting Wheeler for president until it's clear that Roosevelt is not going to run. So Roosevelt decides to run. Wheeler does not run. Wheeler is not nominated to be vice president at this point. There's too much bad blood, I think, between him and Roosevelt. So that's how that'll, and Roosevelt again wins re-election by a substantial amount. But this is where Wheeler's career really begins to turn. What Roosevelt was doing was taking a number of actions that were preparing the United States to enter World War II. And on the other hand, he was saying that he really didn't intend to do that. He wanted to keep America out. There was a movement called America First that sprung up that was opposed to America's entry into World War II. One of its leading speakers was Charles Lindbergh. Wheeler was another one. And they spoke repeatedly and nationally, arguing against Roosevelt's decisions that moved the United States closer to war. Wheeler opposed the Lend-Lease program, which provided war materials for Great Britain. That passed the Senate over Wheeler's opposition. And that, of course, all came to a head when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The United States declared war and declared war on Germany. The America First movement just dissolved, but Wheeler was self-tarred with his opposition to World War II. But he had been elected in 1940, and he wasn't going to come up for re-election again until 1946. So he, continues serving in the Senate during World War II, but his political base was beginning to erode. And finally, when he came up for re-election in 1946, decision was made that within the Democratic Party that he should be replaced. And so Democrats found in Montana Leif Erikson, who was willing to run against him. Wheeler had lost his labor support. He'd lost support in Butte. This was all, I think, based on Wheeler's opposition to World War II. And Wheeler was defeated in the primary by Leif Erikson, in part Senator James Murray, who disliked Wheeler. That dislike was mutual. Murray supported Erikson behind the scenes. Labor support shifted from Wheeler to Erikson. And so Erikson was the Democratic nominee, but he was defeated in the general election by Republican Zales Ecton, who served one term from 1946 until 1952, when he was replaced by Mike Mansfield. So there is an overlap here between Wheeler and Mansfield, and I'll get to Mansfield in a few minutes. But by 1942, Mansfield was elected to Congress, and he became increasingly an expert on Far Eastern affairs. Roosevelt encouraged Mansfield to become more widely known politically, with the thought that Mansfield would run against Wheeler in 1946. Only Mansfield decided not to do that. He didn't think he was ready and couldn't afford to do it, and so he didn't. So he stayed out of the Senate contest in 1946, continued to be elected to the House until 1952, and was elected and ran against Ecton and beat him in the fall of 1952. Wheeler then practiced law in Washington, D.C. He didn't go back to Montana. He started law practice and was successful until from 1946 until 1975 when he died. He had a summer home in Lake McDonald, Glacier Park. One of my friends, college friends, lifetime friends, Ed Rissy, lived in West Glacier and delivered groceries from a grocery store he worked at to the Wheelers at Lake McDonald. So that is Wheeler in a nutshell. I've left out a lot of detail. It's in the chapter, but you can see that his trajectory was one of strong-minded independence, and he didn't care about party labels or party loyalty. He went with what he thought was right and didn't care about the consequences. And his principled opposition to the United States entering World War II eventually did him in, because clearly that was not the view of the majority of the electorate, either in Montana or nationally. So he had an unhappy ending to his career. He also, fought apparently continuously with Senator James Murray, who was elected in 1934, because they did not like each other or agree with each other. And Wheeler attempted to have Murray defeated for re-election unsuccessfully. Does anyone have any comments, questions about Wheeler before I move ahead? All right, well, I didn't know about Wheeler before I read Johnson's book, but he was really quite a guy. And it's remarkable that, that someone, he claimed that he had not changed his position through the years. He viewed himself as a Jeffersonian Democrat, supporter of limited government. But the world had changed and times had changed, and he was perceived as had fallen back out of step, had become more conservative in his approach, particularly in relationship to World War II. But from his point of view, he always did what he thought was right. And the comment by Mike Mansfield at the end is two things that I say at the end of the chapter. Wheeler wrote on his 80th birthday, "If my career has brought me more than one man's share of fights, I regret none of them. Incessant conflict made me live life more deeply." And Mansfield said of Wheeler, "BK left his mark for independence." So I think that's the bottom line with Wheeler. There is a comment speak about the Drake article on Wheeler. Well, that's it appeared as a review of Johnson's book, and it largely tracks Johnson's book. It's a good summary, I think, of Wheeler's career. I don't know what I think that Richard Drake is a supporter of Wheeler. He's a conservative. He's a professor at the University of Montana, or was. I don't know if anyone knows him now, but I included that article because I thought it was a good summary of Wheeler's career. What would you say Wheeler did to support Montana during his time in the Senate? He supported Montana's involvement in the war effort in World War II. There were programs in Montana that he supported. I don't think that he well, I don't know, I guess, in detail if he supported Montana legislation specifically. I think he had decided that to be successful as a senator, he needed to stay out of Montana politics and emphasize national issues more. So I would say he was not a strong supporter of Montana specifically, except that Montana would benefit from the general legislative ideas that he was proposing. So I would say he was more of a United States senator than a Montana senator. All right, Mike Mansfield. As I said, he's really a different kind of guy. He was born in 1903 in New York City. His father was a construction worker. His mother died when he was 7. The father was unable to care for Mansfield and his 2 sisters, so the father sent them to his aunt and uncle who lived in Great Falls. And Mansfield grew up in Great Falls. He had some difficulty, apparently, or the aunt and uncle had difficulty caring for him. The great uncle died in 1912. So Mansfield was in and out of a parochial school. He was at the State Home for Wayward Children in Twin Bridges from 1914, 1915. But he never went to high school, which is a remarkable thing. You know, he's born in 1903. United States enters World War I in 1917. Mansfield is then 14 years old. He tries to enlist in the Navy. They won't accept him because he's 14. So he lies about his age and joins the Navy as a bottom level seaman. Travels on several shipping tours back and forth across the Atlantic during World War I. And he eventually gets released from the Navy after the war ends. He goes back to Montana. There isn't anything there in particular for him to do. He's too old at that point to complete 8th grade or start high school. So he joins the Army, and he's assigned to an Army hospital in San Francisco Bay for a year. And at the end of that, he immediately joins the Marine Corps, serves in the Marine Corps as an enlisted man for 2 years. And during that time, he's assigned to the Philippines. He goes on a patrol to the coast of China to help guard the embassy in China, and is impressed with the Far East, which becomes a lasting theme in his later career. But after, and so this gets him up to about 1922. And no, he really then is still too old to complete high school. He's now, 1903, 1920, he's now 19. And so he goes back to Great Falls, can't find a job in Great Falls. So he comes to Butte and works as a miner in Butte for 9 years, from 1922 until 1931. And what is remarkable about this, it seems to me, is that throughout this period of time, Mansfield had shown no interest or ability in public speaking or writing or anything intellectual in particular. He was doing other things. He did start to, he applied to become an engineering student at Montana School of Mines in Butte in 1926. He was accepted as a provisional student, but he completed a year of classes, but he then discontinued that. What changed his career was that he met Maureen Hayes, who later became his wife. Maureen was an English major. She had graduated from St. Mary's College, which is a part of Notre Dame in Indiana. She taught English in Butte High School. Her father was a prominent politician in Butte. And so she encouraged Mansfield to apply to the University of Montana in Missoula as a provisional student to study history, which he did. He graduated, he dropped out once. He was going to go back to becoming a mining engineer and go to Chile and work in the mines, but Maureen insisted that he stay at the University of Montana, complete a major in history. And he graduated in 1933. He couldn't find a job as a high school history teacher, so he stays on at the University of Montana, receives a master's degree in history in 1934. He applies to 5 other universities for a teaching job. Of course, that's the middle of the Depression. Teaching jobs are not available, so he stays at the University of Montana and is an assistant registrar and teaches classes until he's finally elected to Congress in 1942, except for the last year when he was running full time for Congress. So the Mansfield's entry into politics was really at Maureen's urging. It wasn't his idea. She helped him at every step of the way. And in particular, she was a writer and helped him, or I'm sure, organize his ideas. And the question always was, which Oberdorfer refers to, is, well, what was the relationship between Mike and Maureen Mansfield as his career played out over the years? Mansfield started to campaign for Congress in the 1940 election. Recall that Jerry O'Connell had been defeated in 1938. O'Connell ran for re-election in 1940. Mansfield also ran in that election. He was third in the Democratic primary. So O'Connell was the Democratic nominee, and Jeanette Rankin then became the Republican, was elected. Jeanette Rankin's political career was ended when she voted against the United States entering World War II. And so this congressional seat was effectively open in 1942. Mansfield had campaigned for it continuously, I guess, since 1940. But he was elected in 1942. He immediately got on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, began developing his interest and reputation as an expert on Far Eastern affairs. And that continued until he was, initially in the House, until he was elected to the Senate in 1952. Roosevelt thought, as I've said, I think that encouraging Mansfield to run for the Senate was the way to defeat Wheeler. So Roosevelt encouraged or accepted Mansfield's suggestion that Mansfield go to China during World War II to speak with Chiang Kai-shek, review the situation with Chiang in relation to the communists and the Japanese, report on what was occurring, as a way of building Mansfield's reputation to run against Wheeler. So Mansfield did that. He wrote a report about Chiang's shortcomings and his need to spend more attention fighting the Japanese rather than holding troops back to have available against the communists. And so he continued along that line. What Mansfield said his greatest satisfaction was as a member of Congress was that he opposed a proposal to raise the level of the Flathead Lake Dam, which would have flooded that valley and parts of Polson and Kalispell. Instead supported Hungry Horse Dam, which was opposed by the Montana Power Company. The Congress approved the Hungry Horse bill. President Roosevelt signed it in 1944, and that was an important event in Mansfield's House political career. Mansfield continues in the House until 1952. He continues to travel. He continues to build his reputation as a Far Eastern expert. He writes articles and speeches, reports on what he's doing, and it's remarkable in reading the Oberdorfer book that every time Mansfield does something, he writes a memo, he writes a report, he gives a speech, he writes an article. And I don't know that Mansfield himself had any particular ability to do that. And, and Oberdorfer doesn't really say, but he does comment, and I have picked up in my chapter all of the instances where those reports and memos and letters and speeches occurred. Attached a couple of them in the supplemental materials that I've given you. So that's one of those mysteries that we'll get to towards the end of the discussion of Mansfield. By 1952, Mansfield had decided that he was ready to run for the Senate. Zales Ecton, who had defeated Wheeler, was the Republican senator. Mansfield attacked him as a do-nothing senator. Joseph McCarthy had campaigned against Mansfield. This was the year when Eisenhower was elected president, and there was a general Republican trend, both in Montana and nationally, as the result of, and it caused Eisenhower's election. But Mansfield won by 6,000 votes, and that was the closest election that he ever had. After that, he won by substantial margins. When Mansfield got into the Senate, he befriended or mutually friended John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had also been in the House. He was elected to the Senate in 1952. Kennedy and Mansfield became friends. They were both Irish by background, but obviously Kennedy's family situation was a lot different from Mansfield's, but they became very good friends, and Mansfield eventually gave one of 3 eulogies at Kennedy's funeral, and I've attached those as part of the supplemental materials. During those years, early from 1952 to 1956, Republicans had a majority in the Senate, and Lyndon Johnson was the Senate minority leader. Mansfield became a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and traveled to Vietnam, in Laos, Cambodia during 1953, 54, and began a consistent point of view about the United States involvement in Southeast Asia. His point of view was that the issues there were not primarily military, they were economic and political, and that what really needed to happen was that these countries needed to establish their own independent, neutral governments that were broadly supported within the countries to resist communist takeover in that way. If his view was that if the countries chose military solutions, that would simply antagonize the communists, they would be taken over. And in any event, the United States did not have a substantial stake in what was going on there to justify either continuing French colonialism or becoming involved against China in particular, because that would just lead to a situation where there would be an endless war and the United States could never win it. So that theme continues throughout from 1953 into the Nixon years, 1970, 71. But there's a lot of water in between. And, you know, I've covered it in detail. I can't cover it all here. I urge you to look at the chapter about this. But during the Kennedy years, 1961 through 1963, Kennedy's advisors are telling him that what should happen is that the United States should become involved in Vietnam by sending United States troops there. Mansfield consistently opposed that, and Kennedy had not committed himself one way or the other. There was a meeting between Kennedy and Mansfield in which Kennedy listened to Mansfield's point of view about the problems of becoming involved in Vietnam, and said that he was inclined to withdraw some or all of the United States military advisors after he was reelected in 1964. He thought he couldn't do that before then because that would trigger a conservative response that would damage his reelection prospects. So he is, Kennedy's position is that he is just kind of on hold. He's resisting his advisors' recommendations to send in American troops. And of course, then Kennedy is assassinated and Lyndon Johnson becomes president. The Oberdorfer book is then primarily about the buildup of American forces in Vietnam, Mansfield's participation in high-level meetings with Johnson and other advisors about how the war should be handled. And at this point, Mansfield becomes Senate Majority Leader, and he is Senate Majority Leader from 1961 until 1977. When Kennedy and Johnson were elected president, vice president in 1961, both of them supported Mansfield to become Senate Majority Leader, but for really different reasons. Kennedy liked Mansfield, thought he could work well with Mansfield. He and Mansfield were friends. Maureen Mansfield liked Jack Kennedy very much. But from Lyndon Johnson's point of view, as vice president, Johnson could preside in the Senate, and Johnson wanted to control the Senate by continuing to act in effect as the Senate Majority Leader, even though it's reducing Mansfield's participation or authority considerably. So the proposal is, which Mansfield initially supports, that Johnson will preside over meetings of the Democratic caucus in the Senate and thereby have control of the Senate in effect. Mansfield submits that proposal, and the Democratic senators immediately strongly oppose it. And so it's withdrawn and watered down, and Mansfield is given authority to have anyone preside at the caucus if he wants to, but doesn't have to. And so Mansfield retains control as Senate Majority Leader, and Johnson more or less stays out of the detailed politicking within the Senate. But Mansfield had a different leadership style. He was much more laid back and non-directive. He was criticized for that because people expected that there would be a continuation of Johnson's strong arm tactics, but Mansfield didn't do it, and he was respected for it. He was criticized to some extent for weak leadership in the Senate, but everybody liked him, and the senators were more independent and able to vote in their own way rather than being directed as Johnson had directed them in the past. So, you know, the next, what Johnson got into in 1963, 64 was a situation that he chose to characterize as a war and try to solve by military means rather than attempting to negotiate a settlement that would leave Vietnam essentially neutral. And so there were buildups of troops along the way. Incidents occurred that where Mansfield opposed the buildups, he was overruled. The buildups occurred. One of them in particular was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in the Senate. A United States destroyer had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Senate passed a resolution which Mansfield spearheaded, but he did not understand that that really meant, he said, that the United States could take more initiative against North Vietnam. Mansfield wanted to resolve that incident as an international matter, not as an excuse to go to war against North Vietnam, and he said that that was the greatest regret of his career, is that he had supported the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The other thing that is remarkable about Mansfield during this period from 1963 until early 1970, after Nixon is elected, is that he was the Senate Majority Leader. He was active in promoting and supporting all of the Great Society legislation that went through the Congress during the Johnson years. He opposed Johnson's buildup and the advice of the advisors and the military people for more troops in Vietnam. Wrote memos, repeated memos documenting his opposition, but he never said anything publicly to challenge those decisions. He was walking a line, a delicate line, he said, that was very difficult for him to do, but he chose to be loyal to Johnson and defer to Johnson's authority to carry out the war power once these decisions were made, and not publicly oppose him, even though public opinion beginning in 1965 or so was increasingly against the war. And Mansfield was being criticized because he wasn't critical of these decisions, and he was just going along. But there reached a point where General Westmoreland wanted one more round of buildups that Johnson was prepared to agree to. Johnson was going to give a speech in early 1968 announcing those buildups and saying that Americans should stay the course and support the war effort. But Mansfield met with Johnson a couple of days before that speech was to be given, persuaded him that things had gone too far and that he should not support a continued troop buildup, because all it was doing was encouraging the North Vietnamese to respond with more troops of their own, and the danger of the Chinese becoming involved in the war. And so Johnson backed away and said there would be a minor backup troop support, but he also announced that he was not going to be running for president in 1968. And it's unclear, I guess, how much, Johnson doesn't say how much that meeting with Mansfield had to do with Johnson's decision not to run again. But Lyndon Johnson must have seen that the buildup could not go on forever, and it was going to become a huge thing with no clear end at all. And so Lyndon Johnson decided simply not to continue in office, leaving it to Hubert Humphrey and to continue in 1968. And of course, Richard Nixon was elected instead. So that's the Johnson years. Anyone have any comments about that period of Mansfield's career? I said there are several themes. One is the consistent private opposition to the Vietnamese War, the failure to do anything publicly to oppose it, and documenting everything that he was doing and saying with written memos and speeches, not on other subjects, but a clear written trail as to what his position was on the issues, with the general theme that the United States should try to find some neutral solution that would end the war without it continuing forever. One of the things that Richard Nixon ran on when he was elected in 1968 was that he was going to end the war, and he had a secret plan to draw down American troops. And he did initially withdraw some troops, and Mansfield decided that if Nixon was really going to end the war, Mansfield would support him and not make it a political thing, but just an American thing to try to end the war. So Mansfield met with Nixon many times, breakfast meetings. There were meetings where Nixon was saying one thing and doing another, but eventually the Congress decided that the war had to end. The way to end it was to cut off the funding, and the Cooper Church Amendment, which Mansfield supported, required that hostilities be limited and the American troops withdrawn by 1970-71. And instead, Nixon expanded the war by going into Laos and Cambodia. And at that point, Mansfield had enough. He really decided to support the efforts to end the war by cutting off funding. And that then led to the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which did end the war. Of course, then later, the North Vietnamese occupied South Vietnam, took over Saigon, and ended the war really in that way. Mansfield decided in 1976 that he was not going to run again. So he announced that, and or great appreciation for his service in the Senate. But instead of retiring, President Carter appointed him to be ambassador to Japan. And he served as ambassador to Japan for another 11 years until 1988. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, initially, I think Mansfield thought he would retire, but he had met with Reagan in 1978. He liked Reagan and Reagan liked him, and thought that Reagan thought they could work together. So Reagan continued Mansfield as ambassador to Japan for another 8 years throughout the term of his presidency. Finally, in December 1988, Mansfield had decided that he really had enough and would retire, and came back to the United States. But there is another chapter or two here still, and that is that Mansfield was invited by Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott in 1998 to speak to the Senate, giving a leadership speech that Mansfield had written but not given in 1963 because of Kennedy's assassination. I've attached that as one of the items in the supplement that I've given you, and it is remarkable because of what Mansfield said about Maureen. At this point, Maureen is still alive. She has Alzheimer's. She's not able to attend the lecture. But what he said was, and I have to read this, she was and is my inspiration. She encouraged and literally forced a dropout 8th grader to achieve a university degree and at the same time make up his high school credits. She sold her life insurance, gave up her job as a Butte High School teacher to make it possible. She initiated me into politics, the House, the Senate, and diplomatically speaking, the Tokyo Embassy. She gave of herself to make something of me. She has always been the one who has guided, encouraged, and advised me. She made the sacrifices and really deserved the credits, but I was the one who was honored. She has always been the better half of our lives together, and without her coaching, her understanding, and her love, I would not be with you tonight. What we did together. So that's an acknowledgement, I think, as early as 1998 of the contribution that Maureen made to Mansfield's career. There were a couple of statues that were proposed for Mansfield, one at the state capitol in Helena, one on campus at the University of Montana. And when Mansfield was asked about that, he said he would not agree to a statue of himself alone. It would have to be a statue including Maureen. And so both of those sculptures are Maureen and Mike Mansfield. And again, recognizing the contributions that she had made for him. When I'm trying to find this, when Maureen died in September 2000, Mansfield's eulogy for her was consistent with what he had said in the Senate in 1998. He said, "She sat in the shadow, I stood in the limelight. She literally remade me in her mold, her own outlook, her own honest beliefs. What she was, I became. Without her, I would have been little or nothing." So that, again, it seems to me is a recognition that she made really substantial contributions to his viewpoint, his communications, his career, and all of the memos, letters, speeches, articles that he wrote during his career. They I'm sure they discussed the contents, but I've come to believe that she probably wrote them and he delivered them, and that was the way he expressed his views. He was not always forthcoming in these meetings, and sometimes he would say little or nothing in the meetings, but he always had a memo that supported his point of view on the issue that was being discussed. So that's my take on Mansfield. He was loyal. He totally different from Wheeler. He was loyal to presidents to a fault. Probably he deferred to. He could influence Kennedy because they were friends. He could not influence Johnson until the very end of Johnson's presidency. He deferred to Johnson. He remained loyal to Johnson. He continued as Senate Majority Leader until he decided to retire from the Senate in 1976. He was universally well liked. He was given the ovation when he returned to Washington, D.C. from Japan in 1988. He was invited to come back to the Senate in 1998, as I've said. So he was honored in his own time, and he was well liked in Montana. And so that is my take on Mansfield. And Mansfield was well liked by his constituents. Going to the question about Wheeler, I think that Mansfield was much more in tune with his Montana constituents, both not just during re-election campaigns, but generally. He would receive groups of people from Montana at his offices. He paid attention to constituent affairs. He did not antagonize the Anaconda Company, but he did work for Montana's interests in a way that I would say Wheeler probably did not.
Paul?
Yes.
I worked for Senator Mansfield during the Watergate summer. And I have often thought his particular style of leadership really got us through that time, because he was so well respected on both sides of the aisle that the kind of divisiveness that maybe we see in everything now, so it might not be a fair comparison, but he just had a very welcoming way of treating all other congressmen, and was so well respected in the Senate that I think he really played a strong role behind the scenes in resolving that situation in the way it was.
So what do you think of my presentation about him? Is that fair? Do you agree with that? You were much closer with him than I was.
I had never, well, he was a very taciturn person. I mean, I worked for him for 3 months during that summer. I was an intern. And he, somebody made the comment who had interviewed him that they'd set aside all this TV time to talk to him, and he just would answer, yep, nope, yep. I mean, he did not say much. But he was had a very warm and accepting kind of personality that allowed other people to do the talking, and he could assess situations just really, really well.
What Johnson says about him is that he set up the Watergate Commission, but he did not really participate in it. He wasn't involved in it at all. Would you agree with that assessment? Is that correct?
Well, again, I was just, a 21-year-old cranking out letters. So I can't say that I was an insider there. There were people in his office all the time, other senators and lots kind of on the periphery. But just knowing how well he let people play to people's strengths, I would say that, yeah, he did dabble in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Mary, it's nice to meet you in person. Mary has a distinguished background in Montana politics and higher education in the University of Montana and statewide, and I've appreciated your comments and materials that you've sent. Well, no, I guess one question we could talk about, I guess one other story is an unfinished story about is what's going to happen to Montana. What is Montana and what's happening and what is the future? I've given you a chapter from Jared Diamond's book about, from his book Collapse, about the problems in starting with Montana's climate and mining, agriculture, lumbering, which suggests that Montana cannot and has not continued with the extractive industries that were the basis for its growth initially, but instead that the growth is coming from people moving in from outside who bring money and their jobs and with them, and there are conflicts between people who have been there for a long time and people who are moving in, different values and expectations. And I guess I would open the floor to comment about any or all of that as to whether you, the Diamond book was written in 2005, so it's a little dated, but I would, from conversations I've had, I would think that that trend is continuing. And I don't know what the resolution of it is. Does anyone have any thoughts about that as to where does Montana go, given all of the history that we've discussed and that has occurred? Mary, you're still up. Do you want to talk to that?
I have no idea. I simply cannot prognosticate.
Yeah, well, the choice, I guess, it is in both Diamond goes to that, and the article about who owns the West goes to that, is can Montana, so-called old timers, adjust to the new reality of outsiders coming in for their own reasons, who may or may not be full-time residents, and changes in property values and priorities, and having Montana become part of a larger context rather than simply being isolated and self-sufficient. According to Diamond, at least, Montana is only about 50% of its income comes from within, and the other 50% comes from outside. The outside income and people are needed to help Montana grow, and there has to be some accommodation to make it attractive for people to come in, and for the people in Montana to share in that new development. I guess I can say that as I'm both inside and outside Montana. I can say that as an insider and an outsider. So anyone else want to contribute to thoughts on that subject?
I might contribute as a newbie to Montana.
Okay.
I have to tell you that all the time I was growing up, that my mother had an aunt who lived in Helena, and I remember the letters from Helena, and my mother talking about her family had built grain mills all across the Dakotas and into Montana, and she knew about that from her childhood. But she stayed connected to this aunt. Then in 2013, my daughter decided to move out here. She'd gone through a divorce. She and her former husband, owned a number of businesses, and she decided she wanted to move out here. She loved the mountains, and she had friends here. So she brought my granddaughter. Then my grandson moved out during COVID. Now he is a computer engineering graduate. His company had a small office here in Missoula, and he moved here. And I followed 2 years later because my family's here. So, and I'm a widow. And so we've migrated here, and we love it. I mean, I grew up on an Iowa farm. So I love the outdoors. I like the idea that people are outdoors and are active. And it seems to me, and I just don't see I was very involved politically. I was very involved in education, in Iowa. And I see that kind of commitment to education here. I see, a commitment to the environment that I will tell you Iowa is totally lacking right now because of big agriculture. So there are a lot of things that I've learned to love in the short time I've been here. And I don't know what I met another woman who moved here, same reason, her family's here. So hopefully we're contributing to the economy. My grandson certainly has a very good job and just bought a home, and we're not detracting, but it's an attractive place to live.
So you live in Missoula then?
In Missoula, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, several cities have really benefited from the outsiders moving in. Missoula, Bozeman, Billings. But someone suggested some time ago that maybe Butte was a bedroom community for Bozeman. But there are stresses, I think, as caused in part by increasing land values, because property values, because outsiders bring more money that can raise property prices that locals can't afford. There's the problem of local people having or finding jobs that provide sufficient income to meet the increased costs of land and other things. And how to accommodate that, it seems to me, is a balance point that is going to require ongoing discussion and effort and political involvement and solutions for the future.
You know, Paul,
Yes.
one of the themes of this class that I walk away with is the impact that people have had since the beginning of the 20th century and before that, who came from outside of Montana. Helen and I are both native Montanans, and we both have seen many people come, and we've seen our own children have to leave. But the theme and the stability of Montanans and Montana, I think, listening to the lady from Iowa, it's not an easy place to live. People come and then they experience winter, and many, from what I understand, may leave the state, give up on living in the Rocky Mountains. And with that in mind, whatever, I do believe in the long-term success of Montana. I've got tenants who are from out of state. They're paying more in rent because I've had to raise my rents to pay my costs, but we'll get by. We'll make it. This state will succeed.
Well, thank you for your comment. That's, I think, what I've come away with too, as I did this, just kind of by accident over the years, is that it is like Into the Woods, where the woods exist, whether it's Butte or the state of Montana, and people come in and they act out their story and they interact with other people who are acting out their stories. And that's kind of what it's all about. And if you see the history in terms of the people, that's different from seeing it in terms of who was elected to what office when, and that's a part of it. But the other part is the context of what was happening and what these people were doing to make their contributions to the general story, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. That's kind of what it's all about. So I appreciate your comments in that regard. Well, I would just say in conclusion, I've enjoyed doing this, and I would just add that the Montana history is not that far away at all. We've talked about the fact that I knew two of Wilbur Sanders' great-grandchildren, and there's another one here in the class now. So there's that connection. This was at Butte High School in 1956. I knew the grandson of E.G. Leipheimer, one of my high school classmates who was editor of the Montana Standard for many years. I knew Mike Freeborn, who was the son of Harrison Freeborn, who ran against Burton K. Wheeler in 1940. And, you know, my friend Ed Rissy took groceries to Burton K. Wheeler, and another friend gave Mike Mansfield a tour of the ATO house at University of Montana in 1960. So history is all around. It's not like Plymouth Rock or something like that. It's much more immediate, and the effects of all of these people are there. And I guess that's what I hope you would carry away with. So I've enjoyed this very much. I've appreciated your continued participation, and I hope you've all read the book as we've gone along. And with that, I think I'll just sign off and wish you all the best. And if you have any comments or suggestions, you know, you can write to me separately. But thank you all very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Paul. It was great working with you again. You take care.
All right. Thank you, Terry.